We live in troubled times. Humanity faces a global emergency. And let me just read the numbers here because they're just so incredible. Since 2008, unemployment has increased by 50% in Europe as a whole. 43% of the world's population live on less than $2 a day, while 2.5 billion people have no access to sanitation. 15 million people die each year of lack of access to food, water, and healthcare. The poor are becoming poorer, the rich even richer. Isn't it about time to rethink the global economic order? My guest today is Rajesh Makwana. Hi, thanks for coming to the show. You're the executive director of Share the World's Resources, a not-for-profit civil society based in London.
Yes.
And you're an expert on this. Thank you for coming.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Now let me start by asking you a very simple question. What is sharing?
I guess that's a good place to start. Well, you know, for us, I think sharing is a fundamental principle that underpins life. And we can see sharing in the natural world, we can see it in the behavior of animals, we can see it in the way that we interact as human beings. But also, it's important in relation to how we organize ourselves, both within a country and internationally as well. I think, sadly, there is a prevailing ideology that people are inherently selfish and competitive and individualistic, and this can be traced back to the ideas of enlightenment and Darwinism, etc. But I think human beings are much more than this, and there's now a lot of evidence from various aspects of scientific research, such as anthropology, behavioral science, etc., that gives a very different picture of human nature. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that sharing and cooperation is an innate and integral part of human evolution and human behavior. And without sharing and cooperation, we wouldn't have evolved as a species. So I think, you know, sharing really is fundamental to who we are as human beings. But at the same time, it's a very versatile concept. You know, people sort of think about sharing in different ways. People think about it in terms of giving away what they have. Reciprocity is often thought about in terms of sharing. Another way to think about it is in terms of the commons, or having something in common. So you don't own this water, I don't own this water, but we both share that water, which is very different to giving and receiving something that somebody owns. So these are different ways. I think for us as an organization, it becomes particularly interesting when we talk about sharing in relation to the big global issues that confront humanity at this time. And you know, when we connect it to politics and economics, essentially, and that's when it becomes very interesting.
What exactly are the activities of your civil society?
Well, what we do as an organisation primarily is research, write and communicate our perspectives on economic sharing, on the need to share wealth, power and resources both within and between countries. So we're working on a range of different reports at the moment. We've just launched a new website which focuses very much on sharing on a global scale. And we're looking also this year to launch a campaign which will enable people from different civil society movements, individuals, organizations to sign and support the idea that sharing is something that is central to the work of many different organizations.
Why do you think sharing would solve the problems that we face today among nations?
Well, I think the important thing first is to understand what problems we're talking about. I mean, there are many problems in the world, but for us, our focus is on three or four key areas, which is firstly life-threatening deprivation and extreme poverty. And then, of course, there's inequality, which is growing. You mentioned some statistics earlier. So there's that whole area there. Then there's the environment, where we have the climate change issue, but we have the broader environmental crisis as well. And we have peace and security as well, particularly conflict over resources. So these are the key areas that we're concerned with. And I think it doesn't take much imagination. Obviously, all of these issues are very complicated, and the way to resolve them is very involved and complex. But in essence, and in very simple terms, it doesn't take much to understand how sharing can help to resolve these different crises. Obviously, if we share wealth and financial resources more equitably, then it can help address poverty and inequality. It's also very important for us to organize a new cooperative international framework for managing the world's natural resources, because this can help us to deal with climate change, environmental issues, and to help limit conflict over resources, which is becoming a real issue these days. So these are the sort of issues that concern us, and we think there's a direct relevance there.
So you think that the misery that we see around the world, like poverty, all the problems you mentioned, environmental crisis, are a direct result of a failure to share?
I would say absolutely, yes, absolutely. There are many examples of sharing actually that do exist, but broadly our economic systems and the policies that underpin economic systems and indeed the global economy are not really sharing very much at the moment, I would say. So I could maybe illustrate the extent of some of these crises a bit, if you'd like. Yeah. We can look at inequality for a start. So there's a very simple statistic for people to remember, which is at the moment the richest 1% of the world population own and control 40% of the world's financial resources, the world's wealth. Whereas conversely, the poorest 40% of the world's population have to make do with sharing the remaining a small 1% of the world's wealth. So that's the extent of inequality we have on a global level. And then, we just have to open up any newspaper at the moment to see some of the statistics that you've mentioned. We have 50 million people living in who are technically hungry in America. In the UK, I recently read a report, almost 1 million people now are using emergency food banks to have the food that they need. But of course, the situation is far worse in the developing world, right. Where poverty, extreme poverty, is felt much more acutely. We have, for example, you mentioned the figure there. I mean, it's actually quite complicated with poverty, because there's a lot of people are talking about how we've been quite successful at reducing poverty. But it doesn't take much to look at these figures in a bit more detail to realize that we haven't gone far enough, and we haven't made as much as a dent in poverty as we should have done by now. So, for example, we have, even by the World Bank's estimates, there'll be 1 billion people living in extreme poverty by 2015, which is a hugely unacceptable number. And if we look at $2 a day poverty, we have a situation where at the moment there are more or less the same number of people living in poverty as they were in the 1980s. Wow. So very little has really changed. Percentage-wise, there might be some changes, but overall, in terms of numbers, there's very little change.
But is it becoming worse or better?
It's becoming better in some respects, but it's not getting better fast enough. I mean, there are big questions around poverty lines, how these poverty rates are measured, and what it actually means. If somebody is in poverty when they survive on just under $1 a day, or $1.25 a day, and then they suddenly are able to have $1.50 a day, does that mean that they no longer live in poverty because they have another 25 cents a day? It doesn't really. So these are very arbitrary. And if I can just maybe mention a couple of other issues just to illustrate as well what you mentioned as a global emergency. We have climate change, which we're aware of, which is already affecting 3 million people. 300,000 people are dying every year already as a result of climate change. We have the degradation of ecosystems over the last 50 years. 60% of ecosystems around the world have been degraded over the last 50 years. And we have a very unequal consumption pattern globally as well, whereby 20% of the world's richest are consuming 80% of the world's natural resources. And globally, we're consuming natural resources 50% faster then the planet can replenish these resources. So there's a huge disparity there, and it's very unsustainable. And of course, all of this is fueling social unrest, conflict and war, particularly over resources. We see what's happening, for example, in the Arctic now, with the resources becoming much more available to people, and nations, governments mobilizing their militaries to try and secure access to these resources. And so there's real potential for conflict in various places around the world, particularly over oil and gas reserves. So if we look at all of these different things, then that's why we describe the situation as a global emergency. It may seem a bit dramatic, but actually, I think it really is an emergency. We really need to do something about this.
Right, and with your society, you promote the advantages of sharing the world's resources, as the name says. Why would sharing the world's resources limit their use? Why would that help us?
That's a good question. Well, I think actually sharing and the principle of sharing is at the heart of our sustainability issues. Because really what it comes down to is we have one planet with finite resources which we share. And the question is, how do we ensure that all people can access the resources that they need to live a dignified, healthy life without overusing the world's resources? We have only a finite carrying capacity of the planet, and we have to make sure that we all live sustainably in terms of, some people talk about it in terms of one planet living. So we only use as much resources as we all should if we are all to live sustainably together, collectively, humanity as a whole. And so sharing really is at the heart of these issues of sustainability. And there's lots of debate around this, lots of conversation around this. So in the climate change debate, the ongoing negotiations for how to deal with climate change, sharing, how to share the remaining carbon budget, which is how much more we can pollute safely the atmosphere, is central to these negotiations. And there have been a number of reports by NGOs, even Oxfam and WWF, that have looked at the concept of fair shares, for example. There are other organisations looking at cap and share. And all these ideas were around managing fossil fuel consumption, managing, ensuring that people can develop, nations can develop, individuals can develop sustainably within the limits of the planet. So sharing is really central to these issues.
Now let me ask you, there are already some working, established institutions for global sharing, like the United Nations, redistribution of wealth, they help with food programs and stuff. So why isn't that enough for you?
Why isn't that enough? Okay, you are right. You are right to say that there are some examples of global sharing, which is our focus primarily as an organisation. There are some examples of global sharing, but they are really few and far between and really relatively ineffective. And just the fact that we live in such a problematic situation right now with such interconnected crises reflects the fact that it's not enough. But I can mention some examples. You mentioned the UN. I think that's a fantastic example of sharing on a global and political level. Since its foundation after the Second World War, it's played a big role in promoting international cooperation around peace and security, around social development, economic development, etc., human rights. This is very important. There are other examples. People, for example, talk about the Marshall Plan, which was a massive transfer of resources from the US to certain European states after the Second World War to help reconstruction and development. There are conflicting ideas around how effective that was, how altruistic that was,
right.
But that was an example. Other people mention international aid, which is a very sort of contemporary example of international redistribution and sharing. Whereas I think emergency aid for sort of humanitarian purposes is much more altruistic by nature, I think. There are actually huge problems around international aid. There are massive sort of political interests that motivate that aid, even commercial interests that motivate the giving of that aid. And so I'm not sure I would even describe that as a genuine form of
sharing.
Altruistic sharing, yes.
Right. Yeah.
So I could just say one more thing about that actually. So if you take that into account, these very limited examples of sharing, and then you look at the actual structures and institutions that underpin the way the global economy works. The global economy is very much geared towards the interests of the wealthiest and most powerful countries. And the policies are instituted mainly through the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, in the way we organize trade and finance, etc. And it's here really, it's within the structures of the way we organize ourselves that sharing really needs to be implemented. It's not so much on the surface in terms of redistribution, but it's the very way that the global economy works that
it's
needs
all
to be
based on growth, right? It's
economic
based
growth.
On economic growth.
Yes.
Is that even possible in a closed system?
Is it possible to see? The thing about economic growth is there was a study by the New Economics Foundation, and what they demonstrated was economic growth benefits the richest 1% of the world 120 times more than it benefits the poorest 10%. And so economic growth in itself is no way to guarantee equity. And even that aside, if we look at the issue of sustainability, you know, there's now a wealth of evidence that shows quite clearly that if we are really serious about dealing with the climate crisis and the environmental crisis, economic growth is not the solution. We need a different model for economic development, which is not focused on, at all costs, achieving economic growth. Because as we know, that fosters, you know, an overuse of resources through processes such as commercialization, market forces, etc. And so, no, you know, economic growth is not enough at all.
I found out a number, which is quite interesting, which says we're using the equivalent of 1.5 planets to fulfill our needs.
Yes.
Isn't that amazing? Like, it means that for future generations there will be nothing left, right?
Exactly. It's a shocking statistic, and it's a shame that more people aren't aware of this. You know, things are set to get a lot worse. We can look at, firstly, the way we're geared towards creating a society where people consume more and more. So the ideal really is for everybody to live like Americans do. But again, other reports have demonstrated that if everybody consumed like the average American, we will need more than 5 planets worth of resources to sustain that level of consumerism. Now, we obviously can't afford that. We only have 1 planet. If we lived like people in the UK, we would need 3.5 planets worth of resources if everybody in the world lived like that. And the fact of the matter is, you know, there is development happening in large parts of the world, and there is an expanding consumer class in many countries, China, India, where there's huge populations, and they are aspiring to have more and more. To some extent, that's understandable because we want to make sure that we have access to the basics. But if the model within which they are developing is dependent on such high levels of consumerism for its very survival, then we've got a real problem because we only have 1 planet. And even now, before everybody has developed, we have sustainability problems, 50% more than we can afford to consume, we are currently consuming. And so this requires a drastic reorientation in the way we organize ourselves as a planet and even as nations. And of course, the responsibility is on rich countries because, as I think I mentioned earlier, 20% of the world's richest consumers are consuming 80% of these resources. And so it's in these few countries and these few consumers that have to really make some sacrifices. I actually don't like talking about it in terms of sacrifices because it seems like it's negative, because I really don't think that there'll be a negative to this. I think people can live very fulfilled, creative lives by consuming less.
So you said if we were all living like the Americans, we would need the resources of 5 planets. So there's only two solutions to our global emergency, right? First solution would be fund another NASA program to explore some more 4 planets or so, you know, to exploit their resources.
Yeah, another way to waste resources.
Right. So maybe we could, you know, do it up to 6 planets. However, and the second solution would be we would have to rethink about the way we do economy, right? You've written about the sharing economy. What is this concept? Could you explain what exactly do you mean by sharing economy?
Sure. Well, there are different takes on the sharing economy. There's no particular definition around what the sharing economy is. But what's really popular right now is this idea of collaborative consumption. And it's really taken off in many places in Western Europe, in America, in France in particular. There's a big movement for this. And the sharing economy is really about collaborative consumption. It's about a lot more potentially as well. It's about forms of volunteering and time banking and various other things. It can be quite broad. Some people see it in quite a narrow sense. But essentially, the collaborative consumption sharing economy is about making better use of underused resources. So it could be that you have tools that you don't use, you have a car that you don't use, etc. Making that available, usually through internet platforms, to ensure that other people can make use of these underused resources, which should, in theory, reduce consumption levels. And this potentially is a very transformative different way of organizing economies at the local level. But for us, actually, the sharing economy means a lot more than that. I think the most important, fundamental, and complex sharing economy happens at the nation-state level, not at the local, interpersonal level of sharing. And what I mean by that are systems of progressive taxation and redistribution through the provision of essential social protection, public services, etc. I think these systems of taxation and redistribution allow all people within a nation to collectively share their financial resources for the benefit of all people within that nation. I think this is the most important example of sharing that we currently have in the world. And I think it's a real shame that it's being undermined, particularly by sort of these austerity measures since the financial crisis of 2008. You know, austerity measures have really led to undermining these systems of sharing, and I think this is really problematic. And I'd like to see a lot more support, even from within the sharing economy movement, to strengthen and scale up this most fundamental level of sharing.
Yeah, and you've also written a report on the global sharing economy.
Yes.
Could you?
Yes, I can
some
maybe touch on
solutions,
that.
right?
Yeah. So that was an interesting report. What we did was we tried to scale up this idea of the sharing economy to the global level, because whilst it's very apparent there are many examples in developed countries of sharing economies in terms of progressive tax systems, etc., at the global level, these systems are very much in their infancy as yet. So what we did is we considered, in light of what we describe as the global emergency, what could be a first step towards creating these a global sharing economy. And what we did in the report is we outlined 10 different policy measures that together could, if implemented globally, could raise around $2.8 trillion every year, which is more than sufficient to deal with a number of things. It could prevent life-threatening deprivation. It could roll back austerity measures, and it could prevent some of the worst human impacts of climate change as well. So it could have a really immediate impact on people. It's actually twice as much as is necessary to ensure an adequate level of social protection for all people in the world. So it's a huge amount of money. That it's something like, at the time, 4% of global GDP. And the policies that we put forward were along the lines of financial transaction taxes, which are now becoming increasingly popular, the idea of it, diverting military spending, a proportion of military spending. This frees up huge amounts of finance, of course, cancelling debt in developing countries, and a range of other sort of quite sort of big policies like that actually there's a lot of support for globally already. There are campaigners working on each of these policies, and there have been for decades, some of them. So there's already a lot of support around these, but sadly, not enough support within governments. I
mean, there are policymakers across the Atlantic who wouldn't be amused to hear about your plans to reduce their military budget. Do you have any friends there in that community regarding that? Yeah, I mean, the US, they really spend the largest amount on their militaries. And no, I mean, interestingly, there's a campaign being launched at the moment to end military spending, to end all war, I think it is, and it's an American campaign. So the idea, and there's a very large peace movement, of course, around the world. So the idea of reducing military spending and indeed moving towards a different sort of foreign policy framework and different ways of resolving conflict, I think is definitely taking hold. People want to live in a peaceful world, right? Those are very fundamental changes you propose. Don't you think it requires a fundamental change of the mindset as well?
Yes, it does. It does. I think mindset is an interesting one, because we have a situation where lots of people within governments, and sadly within businesses as well, and economists as well, actually, they have a particular understanding of human nature, certain assumptions about the way we should organize ourselves as a society. Very neoliberal in its outlook, actually. And I think the problem is that's where it's these sort of classes within society that hold the reins of political power and determine the way we organize ourselves more than the majority. And the majority of people, I think, would be quite happy to have a different economic system, one that ensures that they can prosper within that system, but not necessarily in the way that they are now, always trying to earn more money, to spend more money, to keep the economy going. So I think there is a growing need globally and an awareness that we can't continue, that we need something different, and that the system isn't working. It's just that it doesn't seem to have seeped upwards to those who are holding the reins of power at the moment. Right.
I mean, how would you convince them that it needs a change, that they have to change? those who have the power?
Well, I think this has been the sort of focus for campaign organisations for forever. I mean,
Okay.
you know, this is the golden question: how do we create change in the world?
Okay.
And I think the level of change that we're talking about is so immense. I think it would take really an immense global push, maybe some sort of a global citizens movement that can push governments globally to encourage them to make the sort of changes that are needed. Now, that might seem like it's a long way away, but we don't have to look very far to see examples of people's movements having a real impact on policy making and on the public consciousness globally. So we saw a few years ago, we saw the Arab Spring, for example. I mean, that was very influential across the Arab world, and it still is in many respects.
And there now is an American Spring movement as well.
There's an American Spring movement, and of course we had Occupy, which did very interesting things in terms of bringing inequality and the issue of inequality to the public to public debate. And there's the Indignados in Spain. There are various other movements around the world that are pushing for the sort of level of changes that are actually needed. I think one of the next steps might be that there is more communication between these different movements, and that there's some understanding of what their common platform for change should be. And I think that might be a next step that we see. But I think these movements will escalate in coming years because, of course, things are not getting any better. Our trajectory at the moment is towards more inequality and more environmental destruction and devastation. So I think we've still got a long way to go before.
So you believe that humanity is actually ready for those fundamental changes to come, for them to implement, you know, sharing as a fundamental principle in economy, just as it is in nature, but it still takes some time to convince those who are in power, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
You know, I think there's a lot of people who are ready for a change. I mean, we looked at statistics around development in the developing world, for example. I mean, you know, why wouldn't the vast majority of people globally be happy for a different paradigm if it meant that they can you know, live sustainably, healthy, happy lives, you know, in a different way to the way that we're living now. There's no reason why not. What's lacking is leadership. There is no leadership from governments. So leadership has to come from people. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation, but leadership has to come from people. And I think we've seen examples of this already, and I think this is what will continue to happen.
Well, in simple terms, what would it look like, let's say, your vision of the global economy of tomorrow?
Gosh, well that's really complicated because I think one of the problems is to over-theorize these issues. There are lots of ideas about what needs to change and how to change them. The problem is it won't change until enough people want that change to happen, and that's one of the big problems. But in terms of some of the key areas that need to be reformed, I mean, literally everything, I think. If we're looking at creating a world that's sustainable and equitable, we need to rethink our systems of trade and finance, the way we extract, the way we produce, the way we distribute, and the way we consume resources. So, you know, and our economic policies in terms of whether we prioritize economic growth or not. There are so many areas there. But in particular, we've identified sort of 3 key areas that really need to be looked at with urgency, which is firstly food systems. You know, we do not have a food system that is based on the principle of sharing food, which is really how food should be produced. It's really seen as a commodity, it's produced for profit, and we have a broken food system because we have a billion, almost just under a billion people who are still hungry globally at the moment. We also have a food system which is not ecologically sustainable. So it's really devastating to the earth. We have trade systems and intellectual property systems that go against creating sharing food systems. And so it really is a very complicated system, which needs fundamental reform.
Right.
So there's food. We also have, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the need to create a sharing society. So by this I mean systems of social protection, you know, which are lacking in many parts of the world. You know, and so these basic systems of sharing need to be strengthened and scaled up across the world. And the other sort of key area is organizing a cooperative international framework for managing the world's natural resources in a way that is sustainable. At the moment, we sort of go to war over resources when we need them. You know, foreign policy is very much geared towards mobilizing our militaries to protect shipping lanes, etc. We need to shift that, because we cannot continue on that basis. If we are to live sustainably, if everybody is to have an relatively equitable access to the world's resources, and we are to live in a peaceful world, we need a very different framework for managing the world's resources. And sharing, the principle of sharing, is central to all these three key areas, I would say.
Sounds like a vast area of questions to discuss.
Yes, it is.
Where can I find more information about on all of this?
Well, you can visit our website. It's a very easy URL to remember. It's sharing.org. So very, very straightforward. So if you go to sharing.org, you will find a wealth of resources from information about all the issues I've talked about. All of our reports that we publish are online and accessible, the articles and blogs that we have. People can support us even financially. We have various social networking pages, Facebook, Twitter. You can see all the links on our website, and you can access all the information from there. So, you know, I'd invite people to get involved through that. You can even contact us by email, info@sharing.org. We'll be happy to send you through any reports that we have, or if you have any suggestions or ideas, you're welcome to contact us as well.
Thank you. And all the information you provide on that website, you share them for free, right?
We share them for free. We
Great.
do not. We share everything for free. Yes.
Sharing is the future, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Rajesh, for the extraordinary insights into your work.
It's my pleasure.
Share the world's resources. I think it's about time. Thank you for coming to the show, Rajesh, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.